The year is 1940. And something isn't right.
Welcome to part 3 of our discourse analysis series, or should I call it a progression, as we'll see in just a moment. Today we're going to be talking about coordinate relationships, in which you'll see two statements of relatively equal weight, as opposed to subordinate relationships, in which you'll see one main proposition and one kind of a supporting or a subordinate proposition that goes with it. So these logical propositions that we've been working on locating and separating are going to work together to form two different kinds of logical relationships. In the first kind, a coordinate relationship, each proposition will be able to stand on its own, even if you were to hypothetically take one of those propositions away. But in a subordinate relationship, one statement is going to be functionally dependent upon another more complete or more stable statement to sort of hold it together. So let's see how these work in our examples from last week. When you see these side by side, it's easy to tell how they work. In the examples we used last time, the boys ate the bread while they walked to the field. We had the main proposition, the boys ate the bread, and we noted that the statement, to the field, really can't stand on its own. It's a proposition describing the location of the main action, and is therefore only subordinate. But the other statement, while they walked, is similarly a subordinate proposition. It's dependent upon this main statement that really has all the verbal action. But what we'll talk about today is what happens when we take two main propositions, two complete statements like this, and we put them side by side and see them working together in a coordinate, not subordinate, but in a coordinate relationship. But when that happens, you get three flavors of logical relationships. The first is called an alternative relationship. In an alternative, you could say something like, you can get the sandwich for $2.99 or the combo for $5.49. These are two distinct options that are being presented as alternative realities. In other words, you can't have the sandwich and the combo for $2.99. You can have one or the other. In a logical series, you might be thinking of something like a story or a list. Maybe some children that went on vacation would tell their grandparents, "It was a great vacation. We saw Fantasia, we rode the Matterhorn, we went on star tours." And each statement, you'll notice, is making an independent contribution to the whole, as if they were kind of separate items in a list or a series. You should note, though, that this is actually extremely rare in discourse analysis. The reason that logical series are so rare is because this is simply not the way that the scriptures are written. You will not see disordered lists that are presented as a logical series. More frequently, you'll see what's called a logical progression that we'll look at next. In a logical progression, you might say something like, the appetizer was good, and the meal was great, but the dessert blew me away. Each statement comes as a following step within a logical sequence, and each unit is progressing toward a climax or a conclusion for that topic. So how do you tell then the difference between a logical series, which you will almost never see in discourse analysis, compared to a logical progression, which you'll see virtually every time you do a DA? Well, you can think about it like this. If you were to take all the items of that story in the series and rearrange them, it would not fundamentally alter the meaning of that logical series. If the children were to tell their grandparents, "It was a great vacation. We went on star tours, we rode the Matterhorn, we saw Fantasia," if that doesn't fundamentally alter that whole list or series, you're probably dealing with a logical series and you're not dealing with a logical progression. But the scriptures, as they're written, are always taking you somewhere. They're always moving toward a conclusion. These are logical relationships between separate propositions, and they're all tied together because we're going somewhere. So here's a very clear example of a logical progression. It reads, to tie your shoes, tighten the laces, make a knot, and confirm it's secure. I could not reorder these propositions in any other order to get to the conclusion of having my shoes securely tied. Also notice that if I wanted to, I could add in key words. I could say something like, in order to tie your shoes, first tighten the laces, and then make a knot, and then confirm that it is secure. So these will be presented either with or without keywords, so be ready for anything. That's one of the reasons why we highlight, especially when keywords are not present in our discourse analysis, because those are some of the trickiest connections to figure out. Now, we've talked about this in theory, but let's see how it works in the scriptures. In Matthew chapter 11, the disciples of John are coming to Jesus, and they're asking him the question, "Are you the one who is to come, or, keyword, shall we look for another?" These are distinct statements that are representing two alternative realities. He's either the promised Messiah who is to come, as they're asking him, or they need to be looking for someone else. If you can't have it both ways, you're dealing with an alternative relationship. Now let's see how we actually label these and get a little hands-on for a moment. Let's turn the page and look at DA tool. And this is the tool that we use for the classroom. And the first thing that I'm going to talk about is, in that logical relationship from Matthew 11:3, how am I going to label it? First, let me just clear the board, click on Edit, clearing my links, and clear everything away. This is one of the most useful features of DA tool, and it's something that we will often be too lazy to do if we're actually drawing out all of our brackets by hand. This is essential to getting that second and third pass on a discourse analysis. So now let's talk about adding the bracket to the field. I'm going to push Control-2 for an unweighted label. That means that my point is right in the middle. Both of these are propositions of equal value. I'm not going to place any greater emphasis on one side or the other. I'll double-click one end, lay it to the foundation, double-click the other, place it here, and then I'll be good to go. I've labeled an alternative relationship as opposed to what would be called a subordinate relationship or a weighted progression, as we'll see later. I bring this up now to let you know that when we talk about progressions, which we'll look at next, there's a way to place a progression with a progression here and a marked emphasis at the bottom to show you that the next point carries the real weight of the progression. Students often forget this because many times we see progressions that are unweighted with the point right in the middle. So I point that out now, especially before we move on to our progressions. Let's go back now and see how these logical progressions work in the scriptures. In Mark chapter 4, the Lord is describing the growth of the kingdom of God, and he says the soil produces crops by itself, first the blade, then the stalk, then the mature grain within the stalk. But when the crop should yield, he immediately puts in the sickle because the harvest has come. Now you can feel the movement of this argument as he begins talking about the soil that's ready to produce. First comes the blade, then the stalk, and then. And finally, it's moving toward that climax, a very clear climax, talking about the harvest with the sickle. This is a classic example of a progression. And this is something where we see not only the movement of the flow of thought in the passage, but especially my key words are going to confirm for me that this is a progression. Now for this, we use the Interpretive Lexicon of New Testament Greek by Beal, Brenzel, and Ross. And actually the good folks at Zondervan have partnered with us for this tutorial series to let us display this and really show you in our tutorials how it works. So not only are we labeling the English keywords, but we're also including our Greek key terms, which is required for all the Greek connectors for our Greek students, because this will actually tell you exactly what logical relationships you're dealing with whenever those keywords are present. Now, they're not always present, which is why it's important to mark when they are absent. But whenever they are present, you'll be able to look those up and see this term, eta, is actually one that functions either as a then, next, or furthermore in your translation, but it's usually a progression when it shows up in your discourse analysis. Sometimes it shows up as a few other things, but we'll learn about those later. Let's move on now to another example of logical progressions, this one from Romans chapter 8. This is one of the hallmark examples of a logical progression in the New Testament. After the Apostle Paul describes the ones that God foreknew and predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ, he says this, and these whom he predestined he also called, and these whom he called he also justified, and these whom he justified he also glorified. Let's see how this looks in our argument on the discourse analysis field. Let me go ahead and clear for a moment all these brackets, and we can get to work. I'm first going to start off with a basic unweighted progression. So I'll go ahead and push Control-2 to bring an unweighted progression on the field, And for the first layer of my DA, it's easy to double click and just anchor those to the first propositions on the field. What I'm saying here is this is a progression and they're of equal value. I'm not placing a star to show you that there's a major point on one side or the other. I'm actually saying that they're working together. They're coordinating together because they're coordinate relationships. It says the ones whom God predestined, he also called, and these whom he called, he also justified. This is the golden chain of salvation, and everything's working together. So I have an unweighted progression. But based on just what I'm seeing here, I see the conclusion in just this short 3-proposition phrase, and these whom he justified, he also glorified. You could definitely make an argument here that the alpha point of predestination is running through the calling, through justification, and then to the omega point of glorification, and that's where I need to put the emphasis for just the context that I'm seeing here. So I'm going to mark my main point. This time I'll push Control 1 to bring a weighted progression on the field. I label P for progression, and this time a star at the bottom to show that my main point is actually at the bottom of this particular discourse. I'll connect to the outer point. My next major point in each hierarchy always goes on the next layer of a discourse analysis. And what I'm saying here is this. These two propositions work together, and they are one giant proposition glued together as a progression. But then I'm saying this. I can tell you more about that this progression is actually leading to a final progression, which has its main point that I mark with a star here on Romans 8:30, the final point. These whom he justified, he also glorified. And you see that this is affirmed in the passage itself, because immediately when the progression is ending, there's a paragraph mark here by the NASB editors showing that this progression has concluded and it's come to its climax, the conclusion of the argument. If all of this is true, he responds, what then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? And once again, you'll be able to check your work, noting that the chi, as we've seen here, is argued to be a progression, frequently shows up most commonly as a series or progression, although in some cases it can be other things. The dominant use of chi as a connector will be a progression, as we see above. Now let's move on to some final examples of logical series, or rather places where people have argued for a logical series, but I'll show you that these are probably still logical progressions. As a final note, I'll let you know that I have probably used logical series only a handful of times in all of the discourse analyses I've done. And even looking back on it now, a few of those probably should have been logical progressions. One of the reasons why people would argue here in Daniel chapter 2 that all of these different alloys or materials that make up the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream are a series is because they would say, look, you first see them displayed as gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay, but then they're in a different order, iron, clay, bronze, and then you see the silver and the gold. So they would say the order doesn't matter. It's not a logical progression. It's obviously a series, they might say. But I would say this. These are theologically and literarily motivated, and they're presented in a certain order. First, we have the head, which is gold. Then the chest and arms, silver. Then the belly and thighs are bronze. And we move literally from head to toe until we reach the iron and clay. Once we get to the feet of iron and clay, we've gone head to toe. But what happens in the intervening verse is that the stone is cut out from the mountain without hands. And where does it fall? First, to strike the feet. So then, from toe to head in reverse order, it describes the destruction of the statue in terms of the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, in precisely the reverse order they were presented before. Those of you who have studied Hebrew discourse analysis or macro syntax will quickly recognize this is a chiasm. This is an overarching chiasm, and the macro structure is telling you this is a clearly motivated logical progression, not a series, but truly a progression. So be careful with those series, and most of the time when you see one, be ready to label progression instead.